So we've just come from an unprecedented election, and as it stands, we're playing the waiting game. But we're playing a waiting game with lots and lots, and I mean lots, of moving pieces that are shaping up towards a couple of key things. As it stands, we are waiting for the president to announce his cabinet. Lots of interesting movements around who would eventually emerge as the men and women who serve alongside President Cyril Ramaphosa as his executive. You also have a similar situation playing itself out in Gauteng, to a lesser degree, I think. Over the weekend, Premier Panyaza Lesufi had put out an alert that he would announce his cabinet. Shortly after that, he put out a postponement of that particular announcement. Luthuli House coming out saying that it was at the behest of the ANC's headquarters that Panyaza Lesufi was halted. Where I don't think we have a clear picture from the politicians is why that was done, right? He's told people that it's to wait for negotiations to be completed. I don't buy that, because you wouldn't have put out an alert if you didn't believe that negotiations are at a stage that allows you to make an announcement. I think the theory to believe there is that he was going to announce all ANC cabinet members for Gauteng. The back and forth spat over positions between the DA and the ANC have really characterized these talks. A GNU, by definition, should not be about two parties, but that's what we've seen. By and large, this back and forth wrangling between the ANC and the DA. You saw it in Gauteng. They also went on a media tour explaining their different perspectives. You definitely see it at national level, where at some point you have a Fikile Mbalula, secretary of the ANC, versus Helen Zille, the Federal Council chair of the DA. The big parties have really been having it out. And they're having it out as far as the positions of ministers are concerned too. My takeaways: one, they're definitely negotiating in the public. I've spoken about these leaders who are out and about having spats on media platforms. There are leaks galore, leaks of ideas, leaks of documents that we've kind of seen. Of course, the most prominent is that letter from the DA demanding 11 or 12 cabinet posts, an overhaul of departments, where they are given ministerial positions. They want deputies, and they want to replace the DGs, Director Generals, who are not meant to be a political tool or instrument. They're meant to be apolitical, but that's part and parcel of what is wrong with the way that we're functioning or operating as a country at the moment, that this professional entities, bodies, administrators, technocrats have become quite political over the years. As Minister In comes in and drives out a DG and brings in their own, and this revolving door has been happening. That's part of what you're seeing when you hear a DA say it doesn't trust that the DGs and the departments that it will be given will fall in line and listen to the political heads that come from the DA. That is a real concern, and I think it's a legitimate concern on their part. But I want to move from there. I'll come back to each of the DGs. So I said that they're negotiating in public. Secondly, I don't think we're too far off. I think as it stands, we're relatively close to getting that cabinet. We want to see who are the people that he's going to appoint. And I don't think we're too far off at all. I think that there have been lots of difficult conversations, but I also think that there are some cool heads at the table. The ANC obviously using its current elected leaders in order to do so. The DA relying on former leaders. And that speaks to a skills deficit conversation that I need to have a little bit later on about who is in the room in the DA and are they capable? Because if you look at the negotiators on behalf of the DA, they've had to look back at former leaders and rely on those people to help chart a way forward. The ANC is not relying on former presidents, former leaders in order to do this. It's relying on itself. It might consult and get their opinions, but at the negotiating table, it is current elected ANC leaders. That says something about a skills deficit in the DA. I look at Parliament, and the DA is cream of the crop. And I wonder, if you pull out that cream and you appoint it in the executive, what happens to the DA in Parliament? Mind you, it's no longer the opposition. It is now effectively government. It's called governing with the ANC. But again, we're not too far. That's the point I'm trying to make, is that I think they've made enough concessions, and I'm pretty sure we're hours away from a deal and hopefully an announcement of cabinet. Thirdly, these political parties are not only managing each other, right, as previous opponents in the political realm, they're also managing themselves in that their members aren't necessarily all buying into this. I can tell you for free. We've seen people in the ANC protesting that they don't want to work with the DA, saying that this is not a GNU, it's a grand coalition made up, dressed up to look like it is a GNU rather. It's not a GNU. So there's resistance in both parties. But I think that when I listen to the DA again, it sounds like they've almost managed slightly better, because they also have a situation where, if not now, then when? That's confronting them at the moment, and that's led them to partly going along this particular route. In the ANC, you ought to be able to explain what concessions you make to your party. There are already so many people who are resistant and who are pushing back against this idea, including their alliance partners. So whatever agreements, whatever portfolios you dish out, you need to be able to explain what that's about. The DA says it's not looking for Mickey Mouse portfolios. They're not looking for deputy ministerial posts. So again, cool heads, pragmatism, and you really have to find one another, and you ought to find an ANC that understands that it has lost power. I think part of what I'm hearing from some of the parties involved is that there isn't that thorough understanding that actually Congolese, Congi, you've lost power. It's not a question of you can dish out what you want. That would have been the case if you're a 50% party, but you're not. You're a 40% party. I think the question of the DGs I've mentioned earlier, like, it is really wild of the DA to think that where it will be given portfolios at the behest of the president, it will call for a complete overhaul of the DGs. I do think something's gone wrong where they've become politicized, but they're not a political entity. They're administrators. In fact, they're currently running the country because we don't have ministers. They're running the country with the president. Executive authority is in his hands. Government is in the hands of the DGs. And I think that any idea of trying to tinker with them is questionable, and we must be slightly concerned. So the DA's proposal for me is wild, wild, wild. I spoke about how they need to manage themselves. There's also this massive trust deficit. And the trust deficit comes from traditionally your opponents. Secondly, your language of communication is so incredibly different, right? The way business is dealt with in the ANC and how solutions are reached is so different from how a DA will do it. I think one relies more on documents than the other. One trusts word of mouth more than the other. So it's trying to navigate each other's language and comradely language and liberal democratic language to try and find each other. I think that's part of the delay that we don't talk about. Like, the different cultures that have taken shape and built these organizations will clash at the table, but we must find ways around each other in order for them to reach a particular point. The DA wants to make an argument that it believes its demands are fair. I think South Africans, based on the reaction to that letter, don't necessarily agree. The DA is making an argument that it's done a formula, it's calculating based on a particular formula in order to get to where they are. So it continues arguing that it's asking for a fair share. That's about 11 or 12 posts, including a deputy president or minister in the presidency. I struggle with the temperament or lack thereof, no, not the temperament of a leader like John Steenhuisen as leader of the Democratic Alliance. And it didn't matter. He wasn't in government. But the idea that somebody with his temperament, yes, would go and serve in high office. Because when you're a minister in the presidency, you're a senior minister. You call the other ministers to order. And I just can't see it. If Gwede returns to cabinet, I can't see John calling Gwede out and him being heard. Like, I don't see it. But there's this argument about the strategic portfolios. If they can't get minister in the presidency, or rather deputy president, they want minister in the presidency and deputy finance minister. So the ANC is in an interesting place where there's so many strategic portfolios. Do you give them to what is essentially still actually your opponent, but in bed with you at the moment? So there's a lot of back and forth and deliberations and permutations that they need to have gone through. The DA, as I spoke about a skills deficit earlier, it needs to think about what it does with its cream. If you plug the cream out of parliament, how do you leave your party in parliament? There are committees to be chaired. There are us, citizens, who must be represented by what the legislators do in the National Assembly. If you pluck them out, what happens? And that's a question that the DA needs to answer. It's also a question about, again, skills development that it needs to answer. One can ask, what about the ANC on the flip side? I think the ANC, it's easier to answer the question because we've seen ANC leaders being ministers. They've been in action. We know that they're capable. Are they good enough? I think the answer lies in the election results on May the 29th. Simply we're not, as far as the Republic is concerned, because they didn't get a renewed mandate. There's also a sentiment, I think, again, looking at trust deficit within the DA, where there's concerns that they're being asked to play a role of propping the ANC until the ANC can redeem itself as far as its relationship with the electorate is concerned. Again, it goes back to that bartering situation about the numbers. There's also a thing where, because there's so many other parties, and I haven't spoken about them, but a lot of parties have joined the GNU. Out of 18 parties in parliament, you've got at least 10, and I believe even one or two more will jump on board in that GNU, and now they must be catered for. And I think part of the argument that the DA has been having is those numbers to cater for the new members of the GNU cannot come from the DA. So you're arguing that you can't compromise our however many portfolios in order to appease so and so and so and so. The other thing I think we need to look at is some of those parties are 1% parties. They're just a simple seat. And so those people I don't think are joining looking for positions in government. They can't afford to. I think they're looking for either ways to strengthen particular policy offerings, or maybe they'll be looking at committees. I think they're looking at other things. I found it interesting that Al Jamaa, which had previously refused to get into a coalition or any agreement that has the DA in it, is suddenly part of GNU. And then you look at Kabelo Kwamanda and realize that the thing about this GNU is that it's been dealt with as a package deal. So whatever happens at national must happen at province, must definitely happen at local government. I've been saying since 2021, actually, that the metros will remain fluid until general elections, and that is showing itself to be true. They're negotiating with local government in mind. Mxolisi Kawunda in KZN, in eThekwini, was the first casualty of many to come. The EFF, Nkululeko Dunga, it could have been a performance argument, which is what Ekurhuleni said. I think you'll see the rest of those EFF MMCs being shown the door, unless Julius Malema at national level does something as far as the GNU is concerned. So there's a lot. I said moving pieces are plenty in this current story. The DA letter, I don't think was leaked by the DA. I firmly believe it was leaked by the ANC, because the ANC, earlier said, must go back and explain to its own members how the chips have fallen, in essence. So the alliances against the coalitions, the alliance wants strategic portfolios held onto. I don't think that they can afford to do that. They're 40% party. So in order to go back and explain whatever concessions would have been made in these negotiations, it'll say, you saw they leaked a letter, you saw our response that said it's outlandish, they're dealing with us badly. I think the ANC is trying to save face to its own members. That leak came from the ANC, I'm very sure of it. And it's to manage its own members, which is something, again, I've said the parties have to simultaneously do as they chart a way forward. Is the GNU Grand Coalition dressed up as a GNU the best way forward for the country? Only time will tell. Some are already predicting that it'll be around for 2 to 3 years. And these are people who are at the negotiation table. Negotiation table. So it'll be interesting to see. I think the biggest thing for me is waiting to see if they find the necessary instruments, right, that will tie it up in law. The legal mechanisms, the legal mechanisms that will hold them all to this GNU is the only thing. And then the last thing, I think people ask me about Cyril Ramaphosa's fate. The ANC's presidents have not survived a second term of office. The precedent was set through Thabo Mbeki, it happened to Zuma. Is it likely to happen to Ramaphosa? Maybe. Some can argue that the DA wanted nobody else but Ramaphosa, and that might save him time. But what adds some complexity to this picture is that the ANC has 2027 around the corner. And as you know, very often, a lot of the decisions and maneuverings happen with their own internal elective conference in mind. I think John Steenhuisen, if the coalitions did not happen, would have been in trouble. He would have followed Musi's path as far as the DA is concerned. But I think the fact that we had coalitions, because it's not like they did remarkably better at the polls. It's coalition country in the ANC's decline that I think has salvaged his political career. But soon we'll have a new cabinet.